Martha GellHorn's presence on Omaha Beach during the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, stands as one of the most extraordinary, least-known stories of the Second World War. While thousands of Allied troops prepared to storm the beaches of northern France in the largest amphibious invasion in history, GellHorn, a civilian journalist without military rank, official assignment, or legal permission to be there, found herself in the first waves of the landings. She did so not as a celebrated correspondent, but disguised as a nurse, hidden aboard a hospital ship, determined to witness and report on the defining moment of the war. Her determination placed her in a position no other woman achieved on D-Day, physically landing on Omaha Beach with the assault troops. The story of how she arrived there is inseparable from her broader struggle to do the one thing she believed she was born to do: report the truth of war from the front lines, regardless of rules that restricted women to safer, sanitized spaces far behind the action. GellHorn had already built a reputation as one of the most fearless war correspondents of the 20th century by the time the Allies began preparing for the Normandy invasion. Born in St. Louis in 1908, she grew up in a household that valued political engagement, intellectual independence, and activism. Her mother, Edna Feischl GellHorn, was a prominent suffragist, and Martha inherited her unwillingness to accept restrictions simply because society decreed them. She began her reporting career in the early 1930s and made her name covering the Great Depression, documenting the suffering of displaced families, migrant workers, and victims of failed economic systems. Her work caught the attention of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and she developed a long friendship with the First Lady, who admired GellHorn's refusal to sanitize human hardship for the sake of political convenience. But it was the rise of fascism in Europe that drew her irrevocably toward frontline journalism. She covered the Spanish Civil War with unflinching honesty. She saw civilians bombed, cities destroyed, and the machinery of modern war applied directly to innocent populations. It shaped her conviction that reporters had a moral duty to witness these events personally. She believed journalism meant nothing if conducted from hotel balconies, safe press rooms, or government briefings. The only reporting that mattered, she insisted, was reporting done by seeing with one's own eyes. By 1944, GellHorn had already covered multiple fronts of the Second World War, but her path into Normandy was blocked by a structural barrier. Women correspondents were officially barred from landing with the invasion forces. The U.S. War Department saw the Normandy assault as too dangerous and too logistically difficult to allow female journalists anywhere near the initial landings. Only male correspondents were accredited for frontline coverage. GellHorn, both accustomed to and weary of institutional sexism, refused to accept that she could be sidelined from the biggest and most consequential operation of the war. The thought of watching history unfold from London or being confined to safe zones behind the lines was intolerable to her. She applied formally for press accreditation, but was denied. When she sought military transport authorization, she was again denied. Even when she appealed directly to senior officers, she found the same answer repeated: no women allowed. Compounding this frustration was another factor often mentioned in the retelling of her story: her marriage to Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway, already a world-famous writer and GellHorn's husband at the time, used his celebrity status to obtain his own accreditation. and he managed to secure a place on a landing craft for D-Day. Although the two were estranged, personally and professionally, this disparity sharpened GellHorn's determination rather than discouraging her. She was recognized as a formidable journalist in her own right, yet she found herself blocked, while male colleagues, even those with less experience, were granted access to the front. She later wrote bitterly of the idea that military authorities thought war was too dangerous for women, when, in her experience, danger had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with proximity to violence. She had already seen battlefields, bombings, and civilian massacres. Normandy was simply another front she intended to witness firsthand. As preparations for the invasion intensified in the months leading up to June 1944, GellHorn sought alternative means of gaining access. She spent time at coastal embarkation points, interviewing troops and observing build-up operations. She visited field hospitals, supply depots, and troop staging areas. These interactions further solidified her belief that the soldiers preparing to storm Fortress Europe deserved a truthful frontline account of what awaited them. The scale of the operation was unlike anything the world had seen, and she felt morally compelled to be present. When it became clear that she could not obtain official permission, she devised a plan that would allow her to circumvent the restrictions entirely. She would join the invasion not as a correspondent, but as part of the medical support personnel, an area where women, specifically nurses, were permitted. In early June, she boarded a hospital ship under the guise of assisting medical staff. She did not falsify identity papers. Instead, she simply made herself useful, blending in with the legitimate medical personnel preparing to treat the wounded who would soon come streaming back from the beaches. Because hospital ships were not initially expected to land in the first waves, regulations were looser and oversight less strict. Her presence went unquestioned. She carried no reporter's credentials. She packed no typewriter except the small portable one. She brought notebooks, pencils, and the hardened instincts of a reporter who had long learned that access to history rarely comes with permission. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, while battleships and destroyers unleashed bombardments on the French coast, and thousands of landing craft churned through the rough channel waters, the hospital ship that GellHorn had boarded approached the Normandy coastline. The noise was overwhelming. Naval artillery, aircraft engines, explosions echoing across the water. From the ship's deck, she watched the first waves of infantry head toward Omaha Beach, already engulfed in smoke, fire, and chaos. Although hospital ships were not supposed to land under fire, the realities of D-Day quickly shattered regulations. Wounded soldiers began needing evacuation almost immediately. Medical crews prepared to take casualties aboard. GellHorn stayed close to them, helping where she could and observing everything. At a certain point during the landings, she made the decision that would immortalize her place in history. Realizing that wounded men were accumulating near the shoreline and needed to be transferred to medical facilities aboard ship, she boarded a landing craft with stretcher teams heading directly into the chaos of Omaha Beach. No other one, whether journalist, nurse, or military personnel, landed on Omaha Beach during the initial assault. GellHorn did so not as an official correspondent, but because she was physically present, determined to help, and determined to see what was happening with her own eyes. The landing craft approached under fire. Water splashed violently against its sides. As it reached the beach, she disembarked alongside medics, stepping into icy water with shells exploding around them and bodies already washing ashore. She carried no camera crew, no protective escort, and no official status. She walked into the same hell the soldiers were facing, documenting everything through sight and memory. The beach was carnage. Wounded men lay scattered across the sand. Others were pinned behind obstacles, unable to move. Medical personnel scrambled to pull survivors out of the surf, while machine gun fire and artillery continued to pound the shoreline. GellHorn moved between the wounded, helping load stretchers, carrying water, offering whatever aid she could while simultaneously absorbing the scale of the catastrophe unfolding around her. The experience etched itself into her writing. She later described the beach as an overwhelming scene of courage and suffering, one that no reporter could adequately capture unless they had been physically present. When she finally returned to the hospital ship, soaked, exhausted, and shaken, she immediately began writing her dispatch, smuggling it out because she still lacked accreditation. But her report would become one of the most vivid human accounts of D-Day ever written, precisely because she had been there, not in theory, but in reality. Her presence on Omaha Beach remains a singular moment in the history of war reporting. When Martha GellHorn arrived in Britain in early 1944, she found herself surrounded by men who considered war reporting a closed fraternity. Women journalists were not simply discouraged from covering frontline events, they were often explicitly banned from doing so. High-level restrictions issued by the U.S. War Department and Allied command structures strictly prohibited female correspondents from accompanying combat troops during amphibious landings or offensive assaults. This institutional resistance reflected not only military conservatism, but also broader social expectations about gender, danger, and propriety. For GellHorn, who had already covered conflicts in Spain and China, and had built a reputation for placing herself where war was most intense, these restrictions were insulting and counterproductive. She believed firmly that the public had a right to know what the war looked like from the front, and that women had an equal right to bear witness. By the spring leading up to the Normandy invasion, GellHorn was in London reporting for Collier's magazine, which had also hired her husband, Ernest Hemingway. The magazine had chosen Hemingway, not GellHorn, as its credentialed correspondent for the invasion. The decision was, for her, particularly bitter, given that she was the more experienced field reporter in Europe at that moment. Hemingway had charm, fame, and a unique literary voice, but GellHorn had spent years traveling through war zones, interviewing soldiers, refugees, civilians, and combat commanders. She had shaped her career through persistence rather than celebrity, and being sidelined from what would be the defining moment of World War II journalism was intolerable. GellHorn began searching for any possible path to the front. She visited briefing rooms, press centers, and military offices, attempting to persuade officers to grant her permission to land with the troops. Repeatedly, she was told that women were not permitted in the first wave, nor in any wave, and that they were expected to remain in rear areas. The justification given was that women would burden the chain of command during combat, that medical facilities were unprepared to treat female casualties, and that frontline conditions would violate moral norms. The denials strengthened her resolve. GellHorn believed that the stories most necessary to tell were the stories closest to danger, and she was determined to witness the landings firsthand. Her break came through an unconventional opportunity. She learned that medical personnel and evacuation staff would be boarding hospital ships accompanying the invasion fleet. These ships were staffed largely by doctors, nurses, and orderlies responsible for retrieving wounded soldiers from the beaches and stabilizing them before evacuation to Britain. Although women were prohibited from joining assault units, they could serve as nurses aboard these medical vessels. GellHorn recognized that this route could place her near the invasion without technically violating the restrictions placed on correspondents. She applied for permission to accompany a hospital ship as a volunteer, but even that request met resistance. Military officials insisted that journalists were not to be placed in medical units. But unlike combat units, medical ships lacked the strict head counts and pre-assigned press rosters of assault craft. They had more fluid personnel movements, particularly in the frantic hours before D-Day. On the evening of June 5, GellHorn boarded the hospital ship SS Prague under the guise of assisting medical staff. She carried no official correspondence pass for the landing, meaning that once she boarded the vessel, she risked losing her accreditation and even arrest, but she was determined to witness history. While Hemingway and dozens of male correspondents remained behind, restricted to observation at a distance, GellHorn positioned herself on a vessel that would arrive directly off Omaha Beach. During the channel crossing, GellHorn made herself useful by helping prepare medical supplies, distributing blankets, and organizing equipment. The nurses and doctors aboard the ship were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the coming operation, and GellHorn was able to blend in to the organized chaos. The ship sailed through darkness toward the French coast, part of a massive Allied armada stretching across the horizon. She later described the atmosphere as unnervingly quiet, punctuated only by the hum of engines and the muffled anxiety of the medical staff. As dawn broke on June 6th, the enormity of Operation Overlord revealed itself. Ships lined the water as far as GellHorn could see. The bombardment of the Normandy coast began with thunderous force, sending plumes of earth and smoke high into the air. The Prague moved closer to the landing zones, positioning itself to retrieve the wounded from Omaha Beach, one of the two American landing sectors. The plan was for medical craft to remain offshore, while landing craft raced to the beach, retrieved casualties, and returned to the hospital ship. But the ferocity of the German resistance at Omaha, combined with the chaotic conditions of the landing, prevented the normal system of casualty retrieval from functioning smoothly. Many landing craft never returned. Others were destroyed outright. Realizing that casualties would not reach the ship unless someone went ashore, GellHorn took the initiative to act. She boarded a small landing craft assigned to retrieve wounded men. The craft was overcrowded and unstable, tacked with stretchers and medical orderlies bracing themselves against the surf. As the craft approached the shoreline, German artillery, mortars, and machine guns raked the water. Soldiers lay dead or wounded in the surf, and debris from destroyed landing craft floated everywhere. The beach was littered with obstacles, including Belgian gates, hedgehogs, mines, and twisted wreckage. GellHorn was the only woman among the personnel landing at that moment. She did not hesitate. Once ashore, she plunged into the chaos of Omaha Beach, helping to drag wounded soldiers out of the surf, administering first aid, and offering water or morphine where she could. German fire continued relentlessly, and the sounds of explosions and gunfire were constant. Despite the danger, she moved across the beach with the same determination she had shown in previous wars, refusing to remain sheltered or removed from the experience. Her goal was simple: witness the reality of the invasion and help save lives. Throughout the morning and into the early afternoon, GellHorn worked alongside medics and engineers, stabilizing wounded men and assisting in evacuations. She remained on the beach longer than many military personnel, and she saw firsthand the enormous human cost of a landing that had gone disastrously wrong in its early hours. The fact that she was there at all was extraordinary. Officially, no female correspondents were authorized to land. Unofficially, GellHorn had just become the first and only woman to land on D-Day with the troops. When she finally returned to the Prague aboard a landing craft filled with wounded men, GellHorn was exhausted, soaked, and shaken by what she had seen. But she had also achieved something unprecedented. She had directly witnessed and participated in one of the most important military operations of the 20th century. Not from a press tent or rear area, but from the blood-soaked sand of Omaha Beach. As the first hours of the Normandy invasion unfolded, Martha GellHorn moved from the relative safety of the hospital ship toward the increasingly chaotic shoreline, working her way into a position where she could witness and document what was happening to the men attempting to seize Omaha Beach. Her initial improvised role as a stretcher bearer had already thrust her into the center of the operation in a way she had not anticipated, and the closer she moved toward land, the more she understood that the assault had gone wrong in ways the planners had not fully anticipated. The men were struggling to advance beyond the waterline, and casualties were mounting at a pace that stunned even seasoned reporters and medical staff who had covered earlier campaigns in Italy and North Africa. GellHorn, who had seen war in multiple theaters and had witnessed bombardments, frontline collapses, and civilian devastation, quickly realized that what was unfolding on Omaha Beach was on a scale unmatched by anything she had previously covered. Her decision to leave the ship and push toward the beach was not a spur-of-the-moment act, but a culmination of years spent believing that a reporter could not understand war unless she saw its consequences directly. She had spent the previous 2 years fighting for the right to cover the war from the front lines, often against the objections of military officials who did not want female correspondents in forward areas. In North Africa and Italy, she had already proven that she could operate in dangerous conditions, producing reporting of a quality and emotional depth that few of her male counterparts could match. But the Normandy invasion represented something deeper, an operation designed to liberate an entire continent, an undertaking so vast that she feared the official version of it would overshadow the human reality. She believed her role was to record that reality honestly, even if she had to defy regulations to do it. As she worked her way from the landing craft toward the waterline, she saw the conditions more clearly than anyone reading American newspapers or listening to radio broadcasts would see for weeks. The plan had envisioned a synchronized assault in which naval bombardment, air power, and specialized armored vehicles would clear pathways through German defenses. Instead, strong currents dispersed landing craft, bombardments missed key positions, and German fortifications remained largely intact. The men of the first waves were pinned down on the open beach, caught between relentless machine gun fire from the bluffs and a rising tide threatening to swallow equipment, wounded soldiers, and bodies alike. GellHorn observed with the same clinical clarity she brought to all her reporting that the difference between life and death on Omaha often came down to inches. Whether a soldier fell behind a patch of shingle, a piece of metal wreckage, or a shallow depression in the sand. Despite the intensity of the fighting, she refused to retreat. The fear that any rational person would have felt in such conditions was, for her, outweighed by the obligation she believed she owed the men fighting the battle. She considered it a disservice to report on the invasion from a distant headquarters or through carefully phrased military communiques. She saw her job as bearing witness, and in those first hours on Omaha Beach, that meant hauling the wounded, comforting the dying, and taking mental notes for the story she knew she would write later. If she could not take out a notebook without risking her life or those around her, she committed the images and sounds to memory. The screams of the wounded, the roar of explosions, the shouted orders drowned by surf, the sight of soldiers trying to drag themselves through water made red with blood. All of it would appear later in her characteristic blend of sparse, vivid prose. The fact that she was the only woman on Omaha Beach that morning is one of the most frequently repeated aspects of her story, but GellHorn herself never emphasized that detail. She saw herself not as a symbol, but as a working correspondent who happened to break rules when those rules prevented her from doing her job. She knew well that if she were discovered, she would likely lose her accreditation permanently. The Army had already demonstrated that it would revoke a correspondent's privileges for far less egregious infractions, and GellHorn, who did not enjoy the institutional support given to more famous male correspondents, had no illusions about the risk. Yet she judged that missing the invasion would be a worse consequence, not only for her career, but for her conscience. She feared that sanitized accounts written from the rear would shape public understanding of the invasion, obscuring what the soldiers had endured. Her presence on the beach was her answer to that fear. In the midst of the chaos, she found herself working beside medics, infantrymen, and engineers, all of whom were too occupied with survival to wonder why a civilian woman was among them. Few realized at the time that she was a journalist at all. Most took her for a nurse, and she did nothing to correct the assumption. Her fluency in Spanish, French, and German, as well as her experience in earlier campaigns, allowed her to help triage wounded prisoners and communicate with soldiers from different units who had become separated from their commands. She acted wherever she saw a need, whether it involved dragging a wounded soldier to cover, offering reassurance to those in shock, or helping carry ammunition across exposed stretches of beach, where even a crouching man could become an easy target. GellHorn understood instinctively that survival required not only physical strength, but emotional discipline. Her years as a reporter in the Spanish Civil War and in the blitzed cities of Europe had taught her to process horror without letting it paralyze her. What she witnessed on Omaha Beach was far more brutal than the scenes she had recorded in Spain or Italy, yet her response was the same: observe, act when she could, and commit everything to memory. She had always believed that the role of the correspondent was to speak for those who could not speak for themselves. In this case, men who were risking everything to secure a foothold on the continent. Many would not live long enough to describe what they had endured. She intended to bear witness for them. By midday, the tide had changed, and the situation on the beach began to shift perceptibly. Reinforcements were arriving, engineers were clearing obstacles, and infantry units were finally pushing inland. The possibility of being pushed back into the channel, a real fear in the early hours, was receding. Yet for GellHorn, the persistent danger did not lessen her determination. If anything, the transformation of the beach from a killing ground to a tenuous beachhead reinforced her conviction that history was being made not in briefings or headquarters, but in the mud, sand, and blood, where men struggled forward a few feet at a time. Her job, as she saw it, was to remain present as long as she could, helping where needed and preserving the truth of what she saw. Her eventual return to the hospital ship later that day, after hours of stretcher work and near constant exposure to fire, marked the conclusion of her direct participation in the assault, but not the end of her reporting. She had witnessed the full arc of the landing, from the confusion of the first waves to the beginnings of consolidation, and she understood the significance of what she had seen. Her experience would later produce one of the most vivid and human accounts of the Normandy invasion, written with an immediacy that only someone who had been on Omaha Beach could achieve. She knew that all the danger, all the physical exhaustion, all the rule-breaking had been worth it. She had done what she believed a correspondent should do: stand with the people whose story she was telling. The final approach toward understanding Martha GellHorn's presence at Omaha Beach depends on examining the days that followed the initial landings, when the chaos of D-Day began to give way to a sustained and grinding campaign along the Normandy coastline. For GellHorn, the remarkable fact was not merely that she had landed with the first assault wave, something no other woman, and certainly no other correspondent, had done, but that she remained embedded in the unfolding medical and humanitarian crisis long after many observers might have expected her to withdraw. Her work during the days immediately after June 6, 1944, provides insight into her motivations and into the moral framework that defined her career as a war correspondent. Unlike many journalists who saw war primarily through the lens of military operations, GellHorn's perspective was always anchored in the experience of civilians, the wounded, and those marginalized by conflict. This orientation led her to spend much of her time in Normandy, not shadowing generals or officers, but working alongside nurses, doctors, medics, and orderlies who were attempting to treat the overwhelming waves of casualties arriving from the beaches and the hedgerow battles inland. The casualty stations where GellHorn worked were, in many ways, microcosms of the entire Normandy campaign. The wounded arrived in a ceaseless flow, many with shrapnel injuries, traumatic amputations, burns, and severe blood loss sustained during the landings. The medical teams were forced to improvise constantly, constructing makeshift wards out of barns, ruined farmhouses, abandoned German bunkers, or tents hastily erected in fields still within range of German artillery. For GellHorn, this environment had a familiarity rooted in her earlier reporting from Spain, Czechoslovakia, and China, but the scale of the Normandy invasion was unlike anything she had seen. Her first-hand accounts described overcrowded wards where the wounded lay on stretchers arranged tightly on the floor, and where the sound of artillery in the distance underscored the precariousness of their situation. The proximity of the front lines meant that medical units were frequently forced to relocate under fire, sometimes moving the injured on trucks or jeeps while enemy mortars landed uncomfortably close. These days also revealed another dimension of GellHorn's character: her refusal to accept the bureaucratic restrictions that had initially attempted to exclude her from the invasion in the first place. Even after authorities realized she was present, they did not immediately know how to categorize her. She was not officially assigned to any unit, nor was she present under sanctioned press credentials. As a result, there was no formal directive to remove her, and in the midst of the post-invasion frenzy, higher command had neither the time nor the inclination to prioritize the matter. This bureaucratic ambiguity gave GellHorn freedom to move, observe, and work in ways that other correspondents could not. Instead of being confined to press pools or briefed through military channels, she operated with a hybrid identity, at once an unauthorized correspondent and a volunteer medical assistant. This dual role put her in unique proximity to the human consequences of the fighting and shaped her writing during the Normandy campaign. During this time, GellHorn also witnessed the strain on the Allied logistical system. The scale of the invasion was so immense that even weeks afterward, supply routes were congested. Beaches remained crowded with traffic, and the inland roads were often choked with vehicles, equipment, and wounded evacuations. As the fighting in the hedgerows intensified, casualty evacuation became an increasingly difficult logistical challenge. The hedgerow terrain, with its dense thickets and sunken lanes, made progress slow and exposed medical units to unexpected ambushes or artillery barrages. GellHorn later wrote about the difficulty of extracting wounded men from these narrow and claustrophobic landscapes, where medics were sometimes forced to crawl or drag stretchers under fire. The human toll of these operations became a central theme in her reporting from Normandy, reinforcing her lifelong belief that the reality of war could only be understood by documenting the suffering it inflicted. As the Allied forces pushed gradually inland, capturing key towns such as Corentin and Isigny, GellHorn continued moving with medical units, sometimes arriving in newly liberated villages only hours after German forces had withdrawn. These early encounters with French civilians gave her fresh material that contrasted sharply with the military focus of most wartime journalism. Villagers emerging from cellars or makeshift shelters carried the physical and psychological effects of years of German occupation. Malnutrition, illness, and trauma were widespread. Many communities had lost family members to forced labor deportations, reprisals, or shortages. GellHorn spent considerable time speaking with women, children, and elderly residents in these liberated zones, documenting their relief, confusion, and grief. Her writing emphasized that liberation was not a sudden moment of triumph, but a complex and emotionally layered event shaped by the slow reemergence of normal life amid the ruin. At the same time, the Normandy campaign revealed the tension between the military objective of defeating German forces and the humanitarian consequences of large-scale aerial bombardment and artillery strikes. Towns like Saint-Lô were reduced almost entirely to rubble by Allied bombing intended to disrupt German supply lines. GellHorn reported on the devastation left behind, entire neighborhoods flattened, livestock dead in the roads, and civilians searching through debris for personal belongings or missing relatives. This dual perspective, acknowledging both the necessity of military action and its civilian cost, distinguished her reporting from more triumphalist portrayals of the invasion. Her accounts humanized Normandy's civilian population and challenged readers to confront the realities of liberation beyond celebratory headlines. During this period, GellHorn continued to work in field hospitals, where she found herself participating in grueling routines, cleaning wounds, delivering water, offering comfort to the dying, and translating for French civilians when needed. She was particularly struck by the resilience and professionalism of the nurses and medics who sustained these operations. Many of them had been trained under accelerated wartime programs, yet their ability to maintain composure in the face of overwhelming trauma left a strong impression on her. In her later writings, she highlighted their contributions, arguing that their work represented a form of heroism that was often overlooked in traditional military histories. The Normandy campaign, through her eyes, became not only a story of military success, but also a testament to the endurance, compassion, and strength of the medical personnel who formed the backbone of the Allied support structure. As the front lines advanced deeper into France and the intensity of the hedgerow fighting gradually eased, the U.S. Army began formalizing its administrative processes in the region. In this more structured environment, GellHorn's unauthorized presence eventually attracted official scrutiny. Military authorities initiated efforts to determine her status, and she was instructed to report to headquarters for questioning. She complied, and although she was not punished severely, her accreditation as a correspondent was temporarily suspended due to her unapproved participation in the invasion. This administrative reprimand underscored the contrast between her unconventional methods and the rigid frameworks that governed military journalism at the time. Yet despite this setback, her reputation among soldiers, medics, and civilians remained strong, shaped by the tangible assistance she had provided during some of the most challenging days of the invasion. The significance of GellHorn's work in Normandy lies not simply in the fact that she was present on Omaha Beach, nor even in her wartime courage, but in her ability to translate what she witnessed into writing that challenged conventional narratives. Her accounts were not celebratory or sanitized. They were grounded in the immediate realities of human suffering and survival. In documenting these moments, she helped preserve aspects of the Normandy campaign that might otherwise have been overshadowed by operational histories focused on logistics, strategy, and battlefield movements. Her presence among the wounded, the displaced, and the newly liberated broadened the scope of wartime journalism and demonstrated the importance of independent voices, even those operating outside official authorization, during periods of intense conflict. Martha GellHorn's presence on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, remained largely unknown for decades after the war, partly because her own role became overshadowed by the enormous scale of the invasion, and partly because she never publicly emphasized her presence as a badge of glory. Her identity as the only woman to land on Omaha Beach during the first wave, disguised among medical staff and military personnel, was not a claim she repeated for recognition. Instead, it was a reflection of her deeper commitment to wartime truth, a commitment that had driven her since Spain, China, Finland, and every other conflict zone she covered before Normandy. Her landing at Omaha was not the result of special permission or extraordinary status, but the result of her refusal to be told no when the war was unfolding at the most decisive moment of her generation. Unlike many of the officers, medics, and soldiers who landed that day, she arrived without a weapon, without a unit to belong to, and without any expectation that she would be welcomed or protected. She entered one of the most dangerous theaters of the war as a witness because she believed history could not be written secondhand. Her earlier reports in the months leading to D-Day had already established her as one of the most perceptive chroniclers of the Allied buildup in England, and she had shown an ability to move among military circles with ease despite the institutional barriers placed against female correspondents. Her work had focused not on generals or grand strategies, but on soldiers waiting for deployment, displaced families, and the unseen social elements around the war. Yet by the time the Allied command made clear that no female correspondents would be allowed to accompany the invasion force, she understood that official channels would never include her. It was not unusual in the military structure of the time. Women were expected to remain behind the lines, and their contributions were frequently relegated to auxiliary roles. The idea of allowing a woman onto a landing craft during the first assault wave defied the norms of military protocol, social expectations, and safety concerns. Still, GellHorn saw the restrictions as arbitrary, rooted more in bureaucracy than necessity, and she had no intention of allowing the most important moment of the European campaign to proceed without her bearing witness. Her decision to disguise herself among medical personnel, boarding a hospital ship by blending in with staff, then slipping into the landing craft carrying stretcher teams, was both courageous and defiant. It also exemplified a pattern in her career. She repeatedly inserted herself into danger, not for thrill or personal satisfaction, but because she believed that war reporting had to come from the same ground soldiers walked on. Her work in Spain had convinced her that journalism conducted from the safety of hotel lobbies or command tents could never capture the reality of war. This principle guided her at Omaha Beach, where she stepped into the chaos not with the tools of a combatant, but with the eyes of a reporter, trained to observe, interpret, and remember. She helped the medics treat the wounded and carried injured men away from the surf, while simultaneously registering what the landing meant, what conditions the troops faced, and how the battlefield unfolded minute by minute. After the logistics of the invasion shifted inland and wounded soldiers were evacuated toward makeshift hospitals in Normandy, GellHorn continued her work inside field medical stations. Her reporting from those medical sites carried a level of detail rare among wartime journalists. She described the exhaustion of surgeons performing marathon operations, the nurses who managed dozens of patients at a time, the wounded soldiers who asked repeatedly about the progress of the war despite their injuries, and the relentless flow of casualties from the front. The hospital tents beyond Omaha Beach became a kind of threshold between life and death, a place where every hour brought new burdens for the medical teams. GellHorn captured the human element of warfare in ways that traditional military journalism rarely attempted, and her proximity to both the landing and the aftermath allowed her to produce accounts that historians still regard as some of the most vivid descriptions of the Normandy campaign from a non-combatant's viewpoint. Her temporary arrest upon returning to Britain, along with the revocation of her press credentials, highlighted the institutional reluctance to acknowledge her presence at Omaha Beach. Military administrators were unsure how to categorize her actions. She had broken rules, impersonated medical staff, stowed away without authorization, and embedded herself in a major military operation against explicit orders. Yet even as disciplinary measures were taken, senior officers recognized the value of her reporting and the fact that she had contributed meaningfully during the landing by assisting wounded soldiers. While some journalists were frustrated by the advantages they believed she gained through unconventional means, others admired her determination. Over time, resentment faded and admiration grew, especially as her D-Day coverage circulated and demonstrated the power of her writing. After Normandy, GellHorn continued reporting across Europe, covering the liberation of Paris, the Allied advance into Germany, and the discovery of concentration camps. Each of these experiences layered the emotional and psychological impact of the war onto her life, deepening her understanding of human suffering and resilience. Her writing after the war revealed an acute awareness of the consequences of conflict, not only the destruction of cities and armies, but the dislocation of families, the trauma of survivors, and the long-term devastation endured by civilians. Her D-Day reporting marked a turning point in her career, sharpening her commitment to exposing injustice and highlighting the experiences of people often overlooked by mainstream narratives. In the years following the war, the story of her landing on Omaha Beach remained more a footnote than a celebrated event. She rarely emphasized it in interviews and seldom described it in heroic terms. To her, the significance of that day was not her presence, but the suffering of the soldiers who stormed the beach, the medics who fought to keep them alive, and the magnitude of the military operation that shaped the course of the war. Only later, as historical analysis broadened to include the contributions of women in wartime roles, did her feat gain renewed attention. Historians and biographers began to recognize the extraordinary nature of her landing. The only woman, disguised, unarmed, and strictly unauthorized, to land with the first wave on one of the most dangerous beaches of the war. Her legacy today is twofold. She stands as one of the 20th century's most distinguished war correspondents, a writer whose commitment to witnessing events firsthand made her work uniquely powerful. At the same time, she serves as a symbol of the often unacknowledged roles women played in wartime journalism and frontline activity. In an era when female reporters were systematically excluded from combat zones, she refused to accept limitations that she believed hindered truth rather than protected her safety. The fact that she reached Omaha Beach not because she was invited, but because she made the choice to be there, reinforces the independence and determination that characterized her entire life. Her presence at the landing also has broader implications for the history of journalism. It demonstrated that first-hand female accounts of war were not only possible, but invaluable, challenging long-held assumptions about what spaces women could occupy during conflict. The doors that later generations of women journalists passed through were shaped, in part, by GellHorn's defiance. As foreign correspondents like Christian Amanpour, Marie Colvin, and others emerged in later decades, their ability to report from front lines owed something to the precedents established by GellHorn's persistence and courage. In her later years, she continued to travel widely, covering conflicts in Vietnam, Central America, the Middle East, and elsewhere. Her worldview remained grounded in the belief that suffering should be documented, and the journalism served its highest purpose when it illuminated the conditions of ordinary people trapped within the machinery of war. She lived to see her reputation evolve from a marginal figure in wartime reporting to one of the field's defining voices. Yet even as recognition grew, she remained modest about her role at Omaha, insisting that the real story was always the droops who died on the sand and the survivors who lived with the memories. Her death in 1998 ended a life spent in pursuit of unfiltered truth. But her legacy endures in the historical record and in the work of journalists who share her commitment to bearing witness. The significance of her landing on Omaha Beach lies not only in the rarity of her presence as a woman in the first wave, but in the example she set, that the duty of a war correspondent is not to accept constraints, but to find a way to reach the heart of the story. In that sense, Martha GellHorn remains one of D-Day's most unconventional participants, and one of history's most courageous observers, whose presence on the bloodiest beach of the invasion stands as a testament to the power of individual determination in the face of institutional limits.